Welcome to Total Technik. In this video we're working on the Audi Q7. I'm going to show you how to replace the drive shaft or the axle. And the model we're demonstrating on is the 4L Q7, however also applies to the VW Touareg and also the Porsche Cayenne. Let's get it done. So for the removal of the drive shaft, what we need to do is actually slacken off the nut that's hidden in behind this little centre cap on the wheel. Now these centre caps can vary depending on what particular wheels you've got fitted to your vehicle. If you look very carefully at your centre cap, hopefully you may well find that it's got a small hole in it. And that hole, if you do have one, is designed specifically for the removal of these. So you can grab yourself a hook tool, put it inside that hole, twist it through 90 degrees and just use that to pull this cap straight out. However, unfortunately on our cap we don't actually have that hole, which makes this process a little bit more complex. Now if yours is like ours, what you can do, you can grab a small flathead screwdriver and start trying to pry it out. The problem with that is you may well end up damaging the paint on the inner edge just here. So unfortunately, although it's a bit of a faff, the easiest way, if you don't have the hole, is to just zip the wheel off quickly, pop the cap out from the rear and then zip the wheel back on. It's important to note that for slackening off the bolt that's hidden in behind this cap, it must be done with weight on the wheel. So don't try and skip this step and just take the wheel off and try slackening that bolt off with it lifted up in the air. As per the Audi Workshop manual, you must have weight down on this wheel when you slacken off that nut. Very, very important step. So let's get this cap out of the way and we can show you this nut. So with our cap out of the way, we've now got access to the nut, but before we attack that nut, remember, we want to put weight back on this wheel, so I'm going to lower this back down. Now for the removal of this nut, you'll notice that it's actually a 12-point nut that we have there. And so of course what we need is a 12-point socket, and this is a size 32mm. And you're going to need a 32mm 12-point deep socket. A lot of the ones that you get in the hub kits are quite short, like this one. It doesn't really go all that deep onto it. You might just get it out with that, but these are a little bit short. What you really want is a deep socket. So what you really want is something like this. It's got a nice amount of depth to it, and that will definitely go all the way to the end of the nut. If you don't have these already, thankfully they're not that expensive. You can buy a 32mm 12-point on Amazon for around $14. However, you can also get a kit that comes with the 32 and 3 other sizes as well for about $24. We'll add links to both of those into the video description for you, just in case that's helpful. It's important to note that what we're trying to do at this stage, we have the weight down on here. All we're trying to do is slacken this nut off so that we'll be able to remove it once we lift it up into the air. You do not want to remove that nut. All you want to do is just crank it just a little bit, just so you know it's slackened off, and you will be able to remove it when we get it in the air. Do not remove the nut. So rather than the air gun, I'm going to use a breaker bar here because I only want to move it just that little bit. If I put an air gun on it, it might spin it off by accident. There we go, that's plenty. So now we have that nut slackened off, what we can do is lift it again, take the wheel off and get that out of the way. If you have a look at the other end of your drive shaft here, you'll notice that there's these bolts holding it on. And you'll notice that the head of these bolts are actually spline bits, which are these little 12-point bits. Again, we can pick these up on Amazon. They're not very expensive for a set of these. And depending on what bolts you have fitted, it could be a 12, which is what we have here, or you may also have 14. So whichever set you get, make sure it's got both. The ones that we'll add links to will have both. So if you need that, please be sure to check out those links. Now before you try and remove these, grab your hook tool and put it into the insides of the head and give them a good clean out. The reason being is that when you come to put this tool in, you want that to insert as deeply as possible into those heads to minimize the chance of those rounding out. So it's very important to clear out the insides of the heads before you start. You'll also notice that I've got this universal joint bit here, and the reason that you need that is to help you get a little bit more creative with the angles, because you can't get straight in, but having this bit allows you to get into the head, but actually use the angle to get it removed. If you only had a straight bit, you would really struggle. You probably even wouldn't be able to get that out. So again, this is an essential bit of kit. And also, to make life easier, before I attack these, I'm going to put some penetration spray. I'm using a liquid wrench. There are hundreds of different brands. WD-40 do a good version of this, a special penetrant, and that's very cheap on Amazon. Again, we'll add some links for you. The reason we put the penetration spray in is it actually seeps in and it can get into the start of the threads, and sometimes this can make the job a lot easier. So always worth doing this, especially if you have any corrosion on the bolts. Now, for the removal of these bolts, it's going to be a lot easier if you can do it with an air gun. The reason being is that when you put the tool in here and you actually twist it round, there's nothing to stop the entire wheel moving. So when you try and do that, the whole wheel will just want to move away from you. Whereas with an impact gun, of course, it's putting that impact on and off, so it's not going to actually turn this around. When you come to undo each of these bolts, obviously it's easiest if you can always have the bolt in the same location. So rather than try and put your tool in at these 6 different locations, if you can just rotate it, it'll be a lot easier. Now, you can easily do that. You've got 2 options. If you have the entire front of the car lifted, you can go around to the other side of the car and rotate the wheel. This will rotate in the opposite direction. You need to bring this one up to this point. Alternative, a little bit harder, you can grab the rotor on this side and just pull that around, get it in the same place. You might notice as well that these bolts are actually in pairs and they have this little metal arm between each of the 2 pairs. So obviously now repeat this process and get all 6 of these removed. So next we want to remove this lower bolt on the anti-rollbar link. And this is a size 18 and it's got 18 on both sides. So this side is the bolt side, this side is the nut side. If yours is tricky to get out, grab yourself a punch tool and just punch it out from the rear. If we take a look at the knuckle, if you go in behind it, you'll actually see it's got a brake line that runs up the inside of it. And this is attached here at the bottom into this bracket that you can see goes across the bracket and just out the sides here. It's important that we detach, especially this lower bracket, because when we start to move the knuckle, what we don't want to be doing is putting pressure onto the brake line that's on the back, which is a hard line, comes into your brake caliper. And there is also a second bracket in here at the top. This one can be a little bit harder to remove because you can get some corrosion in the screw. We'll see if we can get that one out. Ideally, if you can, you want to remove this upper bracket as well. Let's make a start with the lower one. And this bolt is a hex size 6. As you can see, I'm just giving this screw a bit of a clean out in the hope that we can get the tool in there and hopefully get this removed. Now the bracket should be loose, that flexi line should be nice and loose at the back, the whole bracket can move away from the knuckle. So now we need to remove our brake caliper. As you can see, we've actually turned the steering wheel to bring the caliper to the outside here, so we've got much better access. First thing we need to do, we've got this pin across the centre, it's holding in the brake pads with this H-shaped spring here. We've got a bolt on this end, need to remove that and get this pin removed. So we've got a size 13 bolt. Now I've got to tap this pin in this direction here, so what I'm going to do is I'm just going to put this back in, a couple of threads, so I've actually got something that I can hit, so we don't want to hit directly on the end of the pin. I've got this brake pad wear sensor, I'm just going to pull this out, so I'm not accidentally going to hit the cable. This was relatively easy for us because we've removed this caliper not so long ago. If you're having a difficulty with yours, we have done a brake rotor and pad replacement video. We recommend that you check that out because that will give you some tips on if yours is really sticky. Once you've released this side, you may find it kind of gets stuck. That's because this spring will be placing outward pressure against the bolt here. So on your spring, we've got the brake pad wear cable. Just make sure that that's unhooked just there. And then if you get the right angle, you should find you can remove the clip. So next, coming off of the pad here, this is for the wear sensor, goes through a little loop here on the bleed nipple of the caliper. So now we've got this electrical connector. It's got a little safety catch on it. Sometimes the easiest way is actually coming from the top here. Slide in there, just lift forward and slide it downwards. So now we'll remove the brake pads, and you want to make sure when you put them back at the end of the job they go back in the same direction. Remember, the one with the basically the double cable is the one that's on the inside. Now if yours are in tight, what you can do is you can just press them back a little bit against the piston, just to try and make a little bit more space. Careful as you remove these. Remember, we do have this cable connecting them together. Just on the opposite side of the caliper here, we have our wheel speed sensor. We need to remove this electrical connector. Easiest way is coming at the front, just to lift the little safety catch up and pull the whole thing backwards. So next, on the rear of the caliper, you've got these two large bolts, size 21. And these are holding the caliper onto our knuckle, so we need to get these removed. And then before you remove the second one, just pop this back in and just do it by hand, just a few turns. That will stop the caliper wanting to spin around as you remove this, and of course we'll make sure that it doesn't fall off. So now ready to remove the caliper. Now remember, we've disconnected the brackets on the rear of the knuckle here that are holding these, the brake line, flexi brake line that comes down into the hard brake line just here. So when we lift this off, we want to be careful, make sure that this bracket is free, because what we don't want to be doing is putting stress on this hard brake line. Obviously there's plenty of flexibility in the flexible part of it, the upper section, but this lower section is a solid line. So what you want to do is you want to get a cable tight at the ready, because we're going to need to remove this, but the last thing we want to do is just leave it hanging, because obviously that's going to damage these pipes. So we need to make sure that we tie it up in a safe position. So I think I'm going to actually tie this up to the bottom of the spring here. Yeah, and he's fairly happy there, and we don't have any excess strain on a hard line here. So now we're going to get our rotor and also our dust shield out of the way. On these discs here, you can see we've actually got this security screw, and obviously that stops it from being able to fall off accidentally. But once we remove this, then this whole disc could theoretically fall off. So to make sure it's held in place when we remove that screw, I'm just going to temporarily put a wheel bolt back in as close to the 12 o'clock position as possible, so that we know that once I take this out, it's not going to fall off and land on anyone's feet. So this is a Torx size 50. Now carefully take the weight of your disc, remove your wheel bolt, and then lift the disc straight forward and away. Next, for the dust shield, we've got these 3 bolts, 1, 2 and 3. Because they're a little bit rusty, I'm going to put some penetration fluid on those first. So we're now going to need a ball joint and tie rod separator to help us with the next stages. This is an excellent tool. These aren't very expensive, but you're definitely going to need one of these. And one of these sets are only about $40 to $50 on Amazon. As you can see, they do come with various sizes and types, so these are suitable for lots of different makes and models of cars. And we will be adding Amazon links for these, so if you don't already have one, please be sure to help support us and use our Amazon links. And for the first job, which is our tie rod, we're going to be using the smallest one in the kit. So because we've got corrosion, a little bit of penetration spray here on the nut. So the nut on the bottom here is a size 21. And again, because we've got some corrosion here, it's going to make life a little bit easier. Grab my wire brush, it's going to clean out the threads, so hopefully this nut can come down nice and easily. Just make sure the top here is nice and clean, ready for the tool to be put in there. So here's the tool. You may notice on the end of the bolt here, you've got this little spike protruding from the end. It actually sits in to a little hole they've got on the underside. That helps prevent this from slipping out sideways. And what we want to do is we want to fit these two arms, so they slide in just here, just below the rubber gasket. Then we're going to bring this up into the bottom of this bolt here. So what's going to happen is as this tightens up, we're creating pressure between the top arms here and the bottom here. So this is going to push this pin back up through the bottom of our knuckle here. And be warned, when these go, they do make a loud bang or a snap noise. Don't worry, it is normal, and don't panic, this isn't going to throw this bolt up in the air. It's only going to move it like a millimetre, all that it needs to move, but it will make quite a loud noise. So when you do this, make sure you're always wearing goggles and also ear protection. So as you saw, ours popped nice and easily. We didn't have to put all that much pressure on it. The reason being is that we have removed this not that long ago. Yours will likely be harder than that, but all you do is keep slowly applying pressure, one turn at a time, one turn at a time, and eventually this will pop just like ours did. So now we can just lift this out. Let's move that to the side. So in just a moment we're going to be detaching the upper suspension arm from our knuckle. And once we do that, of course, then the knuckle is going to be free to drop, and so it'll be this lower suspension arm that will be taking all of the weight. And in the Audi workshop manual they advise that you should support that weight, and the way that they do it is to put one wheel bolt back into the 12 o'clock position here on the hub. And Audi have a special tool that they use to brace this when they disconnect it. However, we're using the DIY approach here. So we've got a block of wood here. It's going to come up under the wheel bolt, and I'm going to put a jack under the bottom of this wood, and that will allow me to lower this wood up and down as required. So what we're going to do is just get that in place. You do not want to lift anything, so just enough so that it's snug. That's plenty. We don't actually want to be lifting the car. So now we can look at disconnecting the upper suspension arm from our knuckle here. As before, we've got some corrosion, a bit of penetration spray here on the nut. And I'm also going to clean up the thread with my wire brush to ensure that this can come down nice and smoothly. So our bolt here is a size 18. Now we're using the larger one from our kit. As before, make sure you're wearing eye protection and ear protection whilst doing this. And just for a moment, it's going to drop the tie rod end back in. Just temporarily, just to stop the knuckle pulling away from us. As we saw, that was a little bit more dramatic because we do have some spring in the suspension arm here, but now our knuckle is free. Now we'll just take this bolt off again and take our tie rod end back out. Just to help whilst we're doing the undoing the nut on the end of the drive shaft, I'm going to pop that through temporarily. Just hold that in place. I dropped our little support down that we had holding this up. You can do it temporarily, you're just not meant to leave it for any period of time. I've moved that just to the underside here of the lower suspension arm. I've just jacked that up just again so it's just snug, but I'm not really doing any lifting, just holding it in place. And the reason that we've done this is, of course, we're going to need access now to the end of the drive shaft and the nut there. So now take our 32 long socket again and remove the nut. Now I need to test how easily this moves backwards and forwards. Sometimes, depending if you've got some corrosion in there, they can be really stuck. Other times it's not too bad. So give it a bit of motion. Yeah, it's going to be fairly well stuck. So now I'm going to give it a couple of light taps just to see how easily this moves or not. You don't want to be hitting this really hard and hitting it time after time after time. So it's quite easy to deform the metal on the end here, and if you deform that, then you won't be able to get your nut back on. So don't start bashing the hell out of it. Just a few taps just to see if this is going to move or whether you're going to have to get something a bit more heavy duty. And the other thing you can do to try it is just to use a punch towards the centre just here. Now sometimes if you get lucky, those drive shafts will be quite easy to push back through. However, ours is pretty well stuck and yours might be too. In which case you're going to need to get a little bit more heavy duty with it and use a tool such as this, which is a hub puller set. Now the one we have here is a fairly advanced set, but they do a more basic version of this and they're only about $55 on Amazon, and they are an essential tool when it comes to doing this kind of work. And again, we will add Amazon links for the very best deals available for the hub pullers, just in case you need one. So now we're going to get this hooked up to the car, and hopefully that will enable us to push that drive shaft back through the bearing. The way that this works is basically once you've got the frame set up, you get this bar that goes through the centre and that goes into the end of the axle. It's just made contact there, and then as this gets tightened up, that's going to push the axle backwards. Yeah, so as you can see, we've got movement now. We're pushing it back through the centre of the wheel bearing. If you turn the knuckle now, this will give you the space to push the wheel bearing out of the rear. Now before you can push the drive shaft all the way through, you're going to run out of space. This is where we need to release this again so we can move this knuckle forward to create space behind. So now that knuckle's leaning forward, we've created a load more space for the drive shaft to come out of the back. So the drive shaft is now free of the bearing. So the drive shaft's now free, but you'll notice that the gap that we have in the strut here is too narrow for the end of the axle to pass through. So what we need to do is remove this bolt that connects our strut onto the lower suspension arm just here. And you want to counter hold on the other side, they're both 21. So I'm going to put my breaker bar on the other side, which is the bolt side. On the nut side here, I'll put the air gun, again 21. Now I need to tap this out. Now to get this started, I'm going to put the nut on a few turns. So I can start by hitting the end of our nut. And remember, we do have this support under here, so this bolt may well be under pressure, so we may need to adjust this to relieve the pressure to get this bolt removed easily. So there may be a little bit of fine tuning involved as we go along, just to ensure that we get this in the right position. And that's our axle removed. So this is the brand new replacement drive shaft that we bought on Amazon. We picked this up on Amazon for $112, including free shipping, and it even comes with brand new bolts if you require them, and also a brand new nut for the end. And we will be adding Amazon links for these drive shafts into the video description. So as ever, if our videos are helpful for you, please be sure to help support us in return. Remember, when you're routing your drive shaft, it's got to go in this gap first, and once it's through behind there, then this lower suspension arm gets pushed down, so you can get it under this gap here. Now before we fit this into the bearing, I'm going to grab the copper anti-seize. I'm going to put a little bit of it just on this section here, on this splined area. You don't want to put it on the thread where the nut goes. You want to make sure that you don't put any on there, just this splined area around the centre here. And the reason that you put this on, it just helps stop kind of weather and corrosion and stuff getting in there. It's called anti-seize for a reason. And so when you come to remove this in the future, if you've got a layer of this in, it will help stop it seizing, and so it should make it easier to get out the next time this has to be removed. So now we need to manipulate the end of our drive shaft into the centre of the bearing. So to allow us to do that, we want to push this as far back in as possible, back into the socket, and we're going to have to manipulate this end of the joint here enough to get it to slot into the centre. Now we've got our drive shaft in the correct position, what we want to do is go ahead and start putting some of these bolts back together to make this thing safe so it can start working on the drive shaft. So go ahead and just put your nut back on just a little bit on the upper link. So now we need to refit the big bolt through the lower suspension arm. And again, just finger tight with the nut on the other side. Same with the anti-roll bar. Again, I'm just going to put this back in, just get that finger tight for the time being. And the tie rod back in as well. Again, just finger tight on the nut. Now we're going to start tightening up some of the other connections. I'm not going to torque them up just yet, we're just going to get them nice and tight, and then we'll come back and make sure that they're all torqued up at the end. So next we're going to be looking at this one at the top. A couple of quick notes with this is when you're doing this bolt up, the pin that passes through will probably actually spin in the upper suspension arm here. And so to stop it spinning, what they actually do is they put a Torx size 40, I've got the Torx 40 bit here, in the end of the pin. So you'll find if you put that in, that will actually fit into the end of the pin, so you can counter hold that when you're doing this nut up, and that's obviously going to stop that pin from rotating. However, of course, if we're holding here, we can't use a normal socket. So what I've got here, this is called a through socket. It's a special tool. you can utilise. You can actually put it through the centre while still doing it up. You can pick up kits of these on Amazon. They're not hugely expensive, but a really, really useful tool to have, especially if you're doing jobs like this. And we will be adding some Amazon links, so if this video is helpful, again, please support us. Click on our Amazon links. What we're going to do is we're just going to get these snugged up for now. We're not going to torque them up to their proper spec, we're just going to get them so that they're nice and snug. It's worth noting as well that that rotation on the pin that we're counter holding for, that will actually stop once that socket is in there and under compression. So when you come to torque this up, you don't normally need to counter hold. Let's now come to the tie rod end. You can do exactly the same thing. So next we're going to refit our bolts into our drive shaft. A couple of quick things to remember on this. First of all, it's very unlikely you're actually going to be able to access all of these holes, but if you turn the wheel on the opposite side, just like we did when we removed it, then this will rotate and you can use the same access to put each of the 6 bolts back in. And also remember that between every pair there's actually a little metal plate, so if you are using your new bolts that might not come with the plates, remember to refit the plate as well. And at this stage, again, we're just going to get these in and get them snug. We're not torquing them up. We're going to do all of our torquing separately in a moment. It's always a good idea to make sure that you start these by hand to make sure you're not going to cross thread these bolts. So for the torquing of these bolts on the end of your axle, if they have an M12 size head, it's 90 Newton meters, which is 66 foot-pounds plus 90 degrees. However, if yours have an M10 head, then it will be 50 Newton meters, which is 37 foot-pounds, again plus 90 degrees. Now the problem that we're going to have when we come in with our torque wrench, when we start applying a decent amount of pressure onto here, there's nothing to stop the whole thing rotating. So as we're applying a lot of pressure onto the wrench, that end of the axle will actually start to turn away from us. So what we need is a way to lock this in place so that we can apply all the torque that we need to get these up to spec, but without it being able to spin. Now the way that we can get this to lock is actually use the insides of the knuckle, depending on which side you're working on. I'm going to be tightening up from this side, so this whole thing wants to rotate in this direction. So what I can do to stop it rotating, I can take a long flat-headed screwdriver and just feed that through into this gap here, just so it locks in against this side of the knuckle. And as this rotates, it will get to a point where it locks like that and it won't be able to move any further. That's precisely what we need. Just be careful when you put that screwdriver through that you don't put it in too deep. You'll notice it's not actually touching my lower suspension arm at all. It's only touching the side of my knuckle. So don't press it in too deep. Don't jam it in against the side of the lower suspension arm. Keep it in just an inch or so past the knuckle, and it will get to the point and lock, and it won't touch your lower suspension arm. So I've got the first one in, but rather than go around in a circle as I tighten up the remaining ones, what we want to do is we'll make sure that those two surfaces come together nice and evenly. So just like when you come to refit your wheel, you don't put your bolts back on in a circle, you actually try and make a star pattern. So you're going from one side to the opposite side, to the opposite side, to the opposite side. You can do exactly the same thing here. So just to make a record of which ones I've done, I'm just going to put a little line on the bolt so I know that this one's properly torqued up. So next I'm going to go to a bolt that's on the direct opposite side. Like I said, do it in a star pattern, don't just go around in a circle. So we've done these up to spec. However, the Audi workshop manual also tells you that once you've got it up to the correct amount of torque on there, you also need to do another turn for another 90 degrees. Now in all reality, these have gone to 90 Newton meters. These are the larger headed bolts. There's quite a lot of torque on a bolt of this size, and also the access is very, very awkward. So it's going to be very hard to get 90. You probably won't get it in one turn. You probably have to do it in little increments. So what I would recommend that you do at this stage is once you've got that up to torque, put your breaker bar on it and just see if you can get a little bit more out of it. Remember, you don't want to do it more than 90 degrees, but just see if you can get that a little bit tighter if you can. So now we'll torque up the tie rod. You shouldn't need to counter hold because it's now been snugged up. And the torque for this, 90 Newton meters, which is 66 foot-pounds. And on the upper suspension link here, the torque is 85 Newton meters, which is 63 foot-pounds. And for our lower suspension bolt, this is 150 Newton meters, which is 111 foot-pounds, plus an additional 90 degrees. You want to put the torque wrench onto the nut end rather than the bolt end. And then grab your breaker bar, an additional 90 degrees. And for the anti-rollbar bolt here, 110 Newton meters, which is 81 foot-pounds. And remember to counter hold on the bolt side and tighten up the nut side. So now what we're going to do is we're going to put a bit of torque onto the brand new centre bolt on the end of the drive shaft. It's also worth noting as well that as per the Audi workshop manual, every time you remove one of these it should really be replaced with a brand new one. Now what we're doing at this stage, we're not going to torque it up to its maximum torque. The torque on this is very high, as you'll see later in the video. What we're going to do at this stage is get this torqued up to 150 Newton meters. That will allow us to put everything back together and then put the car back down on the floor, and then you do the final tightening of this when the wheel is on the car and the weight is on the wheel. But just temporarily, to allow us to put weight onto this assembly, we're going to get this torqued up to our temporary torque, which is 150 Newton meters, which is 111 foot-pounds. Now the Audi Workshop manual recommends you actually put a little bit of anti-seize, copper grease, onto this face here that will touch the underside of our new nut. The reason being it's going up to a very high torque. If you get any corrosion in there, the last thing you want this to do is end up binding. So just a thin layer of copper anti-seize, just be careful not to get it onto the thread of your drive shaft. So again, to stop this assembly turning, you can put your flathead screwdriver through and just lock that in place. So grab the correct size socket, which your rest is a 32, and just get this snugged up. Be careful if you're using an impact wrench, you don't want to go in too hard. Then torque this up to 150 Newton meters, 111 foot-pounds. So next we're going to refit our wheel speed sensor. And just snug this up, don't over tighten it, don't go crazy, nice and snug, done. So now we want to grab our dust shield, and this needs to be reinstalled. So we've got our 3 bolts, here. The torque on these is 20 Newton meters, which is 14 foot-pounds. However, if your torque wrench doesn't go down that low, you can just simply snug them up. Make sure they're nice and snugged up, don't over tighten them. So now we're going to refit the disc. Remember, we have this odd hole here, got our 5 holes and the odd one out in the middle here. That's for that little screw that actually stops the disc from falling off of the hub. So when you align your disc, obviously make sure that that hole is aligned with this screw hole right here. Also, optional extra, you may want to put a little bit of copper grease, just a very thin coating on this facing. It helps to stop the disc from binding to the hub here. Like I said, this stage is completely optional. And when you do this, make sure you don't put it into the threads of the holes there. Just a nice thin layer all the way around. I also like to put a little bit just on these outer edges just here. It sits on the inner edge of the wheel, just helps to stop the wheel from ever binding. Just for the sake of speed, I'm just going to put my wheel bolt in there, just to make sure it's safe and it can't fall off, whilst I get this screw fitted. And the torque on this is 15 Newton meters, which is 11 foot-pounds, but all you need to do really is just torque this up so it's nice and snug. So So next we're going to release the caliper and bring the caliper back round and onto our disc. Just keep in mind, however, you've got this hard line here connected to these brackets, so you want to be very careful when you're manoeuvring this back into place. Remembering that bracket needs to fit up inside the centre of the knuckle. I've got the caliper in approximately the right position. I've got the bracket tucked in out of the way, so we're good. So now I'm going to grab one of my bolts and put this in on the rear. All I'm doing is just tightening that up, just a few turns, hand tight, just to stop it from falling away. And just do the same with the lower bolt as well, just get a few turns on that. Make sure we're nice and safe. So now we need to tighten up those two bolts and then torque them up, and the torque's quite high on this. 270 Newton meters, which is 199 foot-pounds. So now I'm going to put the pads back in. I've put a bit of copper grease on the spots where it had worn off, where the pistons touch. And also note that we've got the, this is the wear sensor, and this should be on the inside. The engine should be on this side. And it should not, the speed sensor should not be on the outside of the vehicle. And you notice as well we've turned the wheel outwards to give you a better view. Here it also makes it easier to work on. So now we need to fit our spring clip. This little hook should be at the bottom. So I'm going to feed this up through the gap here. To this position here. So now we've got to take our bolt, we've got to pass this through. It's got to pass through the outside of the caliper, through the first pad, across our spring clip, through the second pad, and through the other side of the caliper as well. As you push it through, you might have to find that you have to push on the spring clip a little bit, just to give you that little bit of wriggle room to get this through. It's worth noting that the bolt side of it here, it's got two flat edges, and that needs to fit in these two little flat edges here. So when you're pushing this in, make sure that you're kind of rotated in the correct orientation so that can slot straight in. If you need to turn it, just grab a 17 spanner, just rotate that as you need to. Make sure you're happy with the position of the clip. You can feed the bolt into the other side. Then we need to torque this up 30 Newton meters, which is 22 foot-pounds. So now this little loop, just tuck that under into the clip. And then you need to feed this cable through this little slot here, just on the side of the caliper. Also pop the cap off of the bleed nipple just here. Feed this up through that little loop. So now we've got to line up the upper and lower brackets and get those two screws back in. Our flexi line here, make sure that sits on the inside like that, so it's actually on the inside of the knuckle before you put this top screw back in. So now we can reattach the connector for our brake pad wear sensor. And next the connector for the wheel speed sensor. So now we're going to refit the wheel. However, before we do so, make sure that your centre cap is removed. The reason being is we need access to the nut on the end of our drive shaft there to be able to torque that up properly. So go ahead, get your wheel fitted, get your wheel bolts tightened up, and then you can lower this back down onto the floor. So for the final torquing of this is meant to go up to 500 Newton meters, which is 368 foot-pounds. That's a lot of torque. And what you'll find, most torque wrenches, including this one here, they probably max out about 350 Newton meters. Of course, if you do have a more industrial torque wrench, maybe a 3/4 inch one that goes up to 500 Newton meters, get that out and crank that on. However, for the majority of people watching this video, what you want to do is take this to the maximum torque that you can with your torque wrench, and then you want to get a big breaker bar and continue to put a bit more torque on there. So just click the torque in now. This is at the maximum that this torque wrench does. This one does 347 Newton meters, so still a fair bit short. So now grab yourself a long bar. You want to get as much out of this as you can. Chances are you're realistically probably not going to quite get to 500. You definitely want to be more than 350, which is where we are now. So we want to get as close as we can to 500 Newton meters. So I managed to get a fair bit more torque on there using the longest breaker bar that we have here. Now, of course, it's not a torque wrench, so we don't know whether we've actually managed to get it to 500. I imagine we're going to be somewhere pretty close. I'll be very surprised if this is under 450 right now. It possibly could be higher. And doing this as a DIY job, that's the only kind of realistic way you can do it. Like I say, if you've got a really expensive torque wrench that goes a lot bigger, does more industrial machinery that will go up to that kind of torque, of course, use it. But most people aren't going to have that. But make sure when you come to tighten this up, you're using a nice long breaker bar. The one that I was using is over 1 meter long. You're not going to get it with like a 2-foot one. The one we've got is nearer 4 feet long. So now all that's left to do is torque up our wheel bolts. They go to 160 Newton meters, which is 120 foot-pounds. Once we've got those torqued up, we can pop our centre cap back in. So that is how to replace the drive shaft on your Q7 or Touareg or Cayenne. And please do remember, we will have the Amazon links for the drive shafts and the tools shown in this video in the video description. So if this video has been helpful for you, please be sure to help us out in return and please click on our Amazon links. And also, before you leave us, please be sure to hit that like button and also consider hitting that subscribe. We hope it's been helpful for you. We'll see you on the next video.